So here we see the skull in its entirety, but it is actually also broken down into the cranium, which functions to protect the brain. And also it is the site of neck muscle attachments. Then we also see the facial joints down, or excuse me, the facial bones down here. And those allow for areas where we have sensory structures like your eyes, your orbit, your oral cavity, right? An opening for respiration and breathing. Nose, also an opening for respiration, and sensory structures associated with the nose. We also have places where muscles attach onto the face and allow for facial expressions. This is also where we have teeth secured to the upper jaw. This is the maxilla, and the lower jaw, which is the mandible. When we look at these bones, these are primarily flat bones. And so you'll remember that flat bones are a little bit different in their structure compared to long bones or short bones or irregular bones. Flat bones have two layers of compact bone, and then sandwiched between them is the spongy bone. And these form a little bit differently than the other bones in terms of embryonic development. So remember, this is intramembranous ossification. These start out as, for example, your skull bones, your cranial bones start out as membranes of mesenchyme that become then ossified. So one of the important things about these flat bones is that they have articulations. This is where the bones come together. And these articulations are referred to as suture joints. And when you are born, your suture joints are not completely fused. And you can actually, when you look at a skull, if it is a young person, you'll actually see that you can actually see the suture joints, where those joints form. But in older people, those joints actually become so fused that you can actually have a hard time seeing them. So when we look at these suture joints, they separate the skull bones. So for example, here we have the coronal suture. So I like to think of this is like you have a crown on. And we can look to see where this coronal suture, what it actually connects. And so you'll notice here that there's a bone here. This is called my parietal bone. And there's actually two of these, but there's only one frontal bone. And so this actually connects the frontal bone to the two parietal bones. So that would be the coronal suture. We also have the squamous suture. So this is what a bone called the temporal bone, and this is the parietal bone. So we have two temporals and we have two parietals, one on each side. And this is what separates those two joints. We also have one that comes down the middle that would separate the two parietal, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then we have, this one is the lambdoid suture. Yep, I spelled that right. There's a B and then a D suture. And this is what connects the occipital bone to the two parietal bones, okay? So those are the suture joints that you need to be able to identify. When we look at the facial bones, two bones that are very prominent are your maxilla, that is your upper jawbone, and then your mandible. So this is the mandible. Okay. Now we can actually look down inside of the cranium, and we can see that inside the cranium, there is actually spaces. And so we can talk about those spaces as being spaces where the brain sits, and that's how the brain is protected. So these are called fossa because they're indentations in your brain. And this is towards the front, right? And this is towards your back. And so this is what is called the anterior cranial fossa. There's actually multiple bones here. Okay, this would be like, for example, the frontal bone. There's a bone that comes up here that is actually called the ethmoid bone, and it actually connects to the meninges that separate your two hemispheres. We can also talk about the middle cranial fossa. And then the posterior cranial fossa. So the cranium protects the brain, and we can look and see what parts of the brain are situated in these different areas. So if I look at my brain in this, I can see that we have, for example, the frontal lobe that is situated, right? So this is my frontal lobe that is in that anterior cranial fossa. And then we have the temporal lobe, which kind of sits down into that middle one. And then we have the occipital lobe and the cerebellum. This is actually a little body that comes off of the brain. It's a little hemisphere. It's even got hemispheres in it. It's called the cerebellum. So you can see how the brain sits within this cranium and how it is protective for the brain. We're also going to look at this particular area right here, because there is a special area that the pituitary gland actually sits in. And the pituitary gland is our master control endocrine gland. And so this bone here, we'll talk about it later, but this is called the sphenoid bone. And the sphenoid bone has a structure here called the sella turcica. And the sella turcica is where your pituitary gland sits, where it protects it. Now, what is this big hole in the bottom of your cranium? This is your foramen magnum. This is your big hole. This is the big foramen. And you can imagine that this would be where your spinal cord connects to the brain. So the spinal cord would leave the cranium, and that is where it connects to the lower centers. So we would have cervical vertebrae articulating with this part of the cranium. So the cervical vertebrae run up and then they articulate. And this part of the cranium is actually called the occipital bone.